Good evening, 4-3. Today we're going to start with lesson 13.6, equivalent fractions and decimals. So the question that we are going to focus on tonight would be, how can you use equivalent fractions to change a fraction to a decimal? And here's one of our word problems that we're going to focus on and see if we could try to answer this question. A pan of cornbread was divided into 12 equal pieces, and 6 out of the 12 pieces, or 6/12 of the cornbread, remains. Write a fraction equivalent to 6/12, and then change the fraction to a decimal. We first want to simplify 6/12, and we are going to find the largest number that we can divide the numerator and the denominator by, and this would be 6. And this, we divide the top and the bottom by 6, and we get the simplified and equivalent fraction 1/2. We know by the last lessons, we've been focusing on the decimal place value chart, and we know that decimals always have to be in the tenths, the hundredths, the thousands, 10,000s, and so on. So our denominators always have to have either tenths or a hundredth or 1,000. In order to change 1/2 into a decimal, we need to first find the equivalent fraction of a half that would have a denominator of 10. Or 100 or 1,000, but let's start with 10. What can I do to 2 that I'll get 10 as an answer? We can multiply it by 5. And like we've done in the past topics, whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. Whatever we do to the top, we have to do to the bottom. So there's our equivalent fraction, 5/10. So if we look back at our decimal place value chart, we will see that this fraction is not a mixed number. So we do not have a whole. So we do not have to focus on the left side of the decimal point. We need to locate the right side of the decimal point, because the right side of the decimal point is the fraction. Find the tenths, because the denominator is in the tenths. Over here is the tenths place. So what is our decimal going to look like? 5/10. No whole number, 0 and 5/10, because the 5 is in the tenths place. Here's another fraction, 3/12. I want to be able to change 3/12 into a decimal. But in order to do that, I need to find the equivalent fraction to 3/12. I'm going to have to simplify 3/12. Because if you look at the denominator, there is no 10 in that, or 100, or 1,000. So it needs to be simplified. And then find an equivalent fraction so we can turn it and convert it into a decimal. So what number does 3 and 12 share that we can reduce it by? We can divide the top and the bottom by 3, and we get 1/4. Now we have a simplified and equivalent fraction of 3/12, and it's 1/4. 1/4, we need to change this into an equivalent fraction where the denominator can have either a 10, 100, or 1,000. If I start with 10, there is nothing that I can multiply 4 with that gives me 10. 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, so 10 does not work. So we need to get rid of 10. The next one that we can try after 10 would be 100. So 4 times what gives us 100? Now if you think of money, there are 4 quarters in 100. So what about 25? Like 25 cents times 4 is $1. Whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So our equivalent fraction of 1/4 is 25 hundredths. Let's refer back to our decimal place value chart and see how we can convert 25 over 100 as a decimal. So this is not a mixed number. So we do not need the left-hand side of this chart because that's our whole number. We are going to look to the right side of our decimal point because that focuses on the fractional part. This is not the tenths. However, this is the hundredths because the denominator is in the hundredths place. So what is 25 hundredths equal to a decimal point? I'm sorry, equal to a decimal. We have no whole. Here's our decimal. And the 5 is in the hundredths place. The 2 is in the tenths, and the 5 is in the hundredths place. So the converted decimal of 25 hundredths is 0.25, 25 hundredths. What about 3/4? What can we do to 3/4 so we can convert it into a decimal? Well, we first need to change it to give it to an equivalent fraction. What would be an equivalent fraction of 3/4 where we are going to either have a 10, 100, or 1,000 in the denominator? So again, if I put a 10 here, let's try 10 first. There is nothing that I can do that I can multiply 4 to get 10. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. There's nothing that I can multiply 4 with to get 10. So we cannot have 10. We need to change it. What's the next one? Tenths, hundredths. Let's try 100. Now again, let's think about back to that money. What can we do to bring us 4 times what to gives us 100? And we are going to try 25. Because doesn't 4/4 equal $1? 4 times 25 equals 100. Whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top. 3 times 25? Well, let's think about that. How many 3/4 is equal to how much? 75 cents. So 75 hundredths is an equivalent fraction of 3/4. All right, now 75 hundredths is our new equivalent fraction from 3/4. This is not a mixed number, so we will not be needing the left-hand side of the decimal point. However, we'll be focusing on the right-hand side because that's the fractional part. And if we're going to locate the tenths, the 7 is in the tenths place, and the 5 is in the hundredths place. So what does this look like as a decimal? There is no whole number. We need our decimal point. 7 is in the tenths place, and the 5 is in the hundredths place. 75 hundredths. 4-3, I want to give you something that I want you to memorize. I always want you to remember that 1/2 as a fraction is always equal to 0.5 or 0 and 50 hundredths. It could be equal to 0 and 5 tenths or 0 and 50 hundredths. Just like 50 cents, half of $1. Now 1/4, I always want you to remember, it is 0 and 25 hundredths. It's always equal to that, because what is 1/4 of $1? It's 25 cents. The last one I want you to remember is 3/4. This is always equal to 0 and 75 hundredths. Because, think about it, how many quarters equals 75 cents? 3. 3 out of 4 quarters equals 75 cents. So 3/4 is equal to 75 hundredths. All right, 2/5 equals blank over 10. I would like to see us write each fraction as a decimal. So first we have to find the equivalent fraction 2/5. And remember, we need the denominator to be 10, 100, or 1,000, so on. What do we have to do to 5 so we can get 10 in the denominator? We multiply by 2. And whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So it becomes 4/10. What does 4/10 look like as a decimal? There is no whole number. This was not a mixed number. Put our decimal. And the 4 is in the tenths place. So it's 4/10. Now let's look at 2/4 and 0 and 35 hundredths. I want to know, are these two equivalent? Are they equal to each other? Well, in order to find this, let's look at 2/4. We need to simplify 2/4. And we know that we can divide the top and the bottom by 2 to get 1/2. Now, remember, in order to change it to a decimal, we need to change that denominator to a 10, 100, or 1,000. So we're always going to start with 10 to see if that works. So we'll put a 10 over here. 2 times what gives us 10? 5. 1 times 5 is 5. So it's 5/10. What does 5/10 look like as a decimal? 0.5. 5/10, because the 5 is in the tenths place. And remember what I said, 1/2 is always going to equal to 0.5 or 0.50. So 2/4 and 0.35 hundredths are not equivalent. 2/4 is equivalent to 5/10. All right, 4-3, let's see how much you've learned. Let's try 1/5. Please write this as a decimal. 2/8. Try this one as a decimal. 1/5 and 0 and 15 hundredths. Are those two equivalent? Yes or no? What about 6/12? Convert that into a decimal. And 3/5. Convert that as a decimal. Way to go, guys. Another successful lesson. Can't wait to work with you guys tomorrow on this. Have a wonderful night.